We just published a video talking about 1% lows and 0.1% lows for frame rates and frame time testing and methodology, accuracy, things like that. And part of presentation of data when we do these benchmarks on GPUs or cases or CPUs is talking about delta T over ambient temperatures. So that's a pretty critical point that I wanted to make a separate video explaining, because it doesn't seem like it's necessarily universally understood. So here's the thing with case testing. Test something like this versus an H440 or whatever, whatever the Fantex one is that I hated on. When you're doing case testing and you're looking at temperature values, just pulling an actual measurement straight from the CPU or straight from the GPU without accounting for the ambient temperature or the environment temperature of the house or test area, there could be variance in that ambient temperature that makes the 1 to 2 degree differences in a lot of instances basically gone. Or you could even have cases trade spots when they shouldn't, just because you haven't accounted for ambient. So let's talk about that. The ambient temperature of this room I'm in right now is probably somewhere in the range of 68 to 72 Fahrenheit, depending on whatever the thermostat's set to. But it also depends on things like how hot that wall is from the sun if we're doing something during the day, or where the vents are located in the ceiling. And so when you have these different variables, doing one case test one day to the next, there can actually be a very large change. So as an example, many years ago, when I first did case reviews and before taking about a year break between them, I had a case like this. I ran a test on it one day, it was X degrees, and then the next day it was X degrees plus 2, and then the day after that it was X degrees minus 2, or 1, or whatever. And so there's this big range of a couple degrees. So to get rid of that, we came up with this solution that I talked about in our thermal test chamber video. So we validated our methodology using a thermal chamber and proved that it was basically 100% reliable. And you can find that video in the end slate, I suppose, or in the description below. But we use one of these. This is a thermocouple reader. This is a K-type thermocouple. It can withstand a serious amount of heat, I think 800 degrees Celsius or something. And we run it actively, and I keep one of these measuring ambient, and if we want extra validation, I'll put another one on and measure somewhere else in the case, like the intake or the exhaust or whatever, in front of the CPU fan. But the one measuring ambient right now says it's 23 degrees Celsius, 22.8 degrees Celsius, 23.1. So a bit of a fluctuation there. I log that value actively every second, and we log the CPU diode every second, the GPU diode every second, PCH, whatever. And then take this data, put it in a spreadsheet in one column, take this data for, say, the CPU, put it in another column, and then you subtract this from the CPU temperature. That gives you what we call a delta T value, or the temperature difference when subtracting ambient. And so now, let's say I take this case and I test it against, what's something not NZXT that we liked, the 400C, or the 600C. So we take this case, have a 600C here, run them both through the bench, and I subtract the data from test 1 from this out of this case, and test 2 from this out of that case. Now we have basically perfectly comparable results, accounting for, and again, this is still fluctuating, it's at 21.5 now, accounting for that fluctuation in ambient. And that fluctuation can be big, just as an example of some instances where you will see a change in ambient. Positioning this case here versus where the camera is, there would be a difference in performance. So this eliminates the issue of needing to be 100% of the time in the same exact spot. It also eliminates the concern of, is AC on, is heating on, or is neither on? And then there's further concern there. If you're heating and air, if your HVAC system is toggling on and off throughout the test because it's trying to sustain one temperature, that will change the results too. So there's a ton of variables. Another one, opening the door and walking into the room and walking out of the room. If it's enough of a gust, it will change the temperature by a couple tenths of a degree maximally. If you have more people in the room, it gets hotter. If you're running multiple systems doing multiple tests, it gets hotter. If it's winter or summer, hotter or colder type of thing. So it's very important to do this ambient subtraction and create a delta value. And if you're looking at results that don't do this or don't account for this somehow, there could be a couple degree variance in data, which oftentimes in the instance of a case or a GPU cooler between vendors, EVGA versus MSI, or a CPU cooler, oftentimes they're fighting over 1 degree max because thermal's hard, and we've kind of gone a long way with it, and there's not a lot of room to go further without increasing the cost substantially for these cooling units. So when you're fighting over a single degree, it's important to make sure we're illustrating who wins that 1 point, because even though it's mostly irrelevant for everyday use, it's still differentiating sort of a superiority of design for a specific use case. Now, there are instances where several degrees will differentiate cases. So for example, by the point of this thing going live, probably our Origin Chronos system build review will go live. And in that mini ITX system, we saw the GPU with a 55% GPU VRM fan speed at blowing 55% of the speed. We saw that hitting something like 90 Celsius for the actual total temperature, or that would be in the 70s for the delta. And then you might see another mini ITX like the NZXT Manta, a bit bigger, but hitting something like in the 80s. That's a big difference. That's a 10-degree difference, and that impacts things in the form of frequency over time. So if you look at a frequency over time chart, as the case gets hotter and sort of equalizes at whatever temperature it's going to equalize at, the frequency might start at 2 gigahertz but fall to 1.6 gigahertz. And that impacts your frame rate pretty massively. So that's an instance where there are real temperature differences, 10 degrees plus in some cases, but most of the time it is about 1 degree. So we do this delta T subtraction. So when I talk about a GPU running at 0.45 Celsius idle, which I think one of our liquid-cooled GPUs ran at, maybe the RX 480, it was around 1 degree Celsius idle. When I say that, I don't mean that it's near freezing. That's not what we're saying, because it is not possible for your GPU, your CPU, it's not possible for any of these components to be less than ambient, because the air you're pulling into the system is going to be 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 20, 21 degrees Celsius. That air, just by going through a fan, doesn't get colder than it was when it went in. It might accelerate it, and that certainly helps things. It dissipates the heat faster through the fins, but it's not going to be colder than ambient. So when I say a temperature idle is 1 degree Celsius, what we actually mean in real terms, without the delta values, is it's 1 degree plus the ambient temperature. So it's effectively an offset. So if ambient was 20, then that means we read the GPU as 21 Celsius. So that's what that means. Now the next thing is our ambient temperature is way different from yours potentially. There's a big range. So folks who are located in dry versus humid areas, or in a desert that's hot versus somewhere colder, that's going to impact your ambient as well. So what you should do with these numbers is when you see us reporting something like a 70 degrees Celsius GPU load temperature, so 70 Celsius, you go to your own thermostat, you look at the temperature that it is in the house and convert that to Celsius, and then add that to the value. So let's say that your house is 30 degrees Celsius because you're in a hot climate. 30 plus 70, that's 100 degrees. That's a big deal. So that means that your GPU is probably past or hitting the TJ max, and it's throttling down to control the frequency so that it can lower its temperature. So that's where something like that would really matter. Maybe you're in a 20 degree ambient environment. 70 plus 20 is 90. You have much less of an issue than the person at 100 degrees. Still an issue, but a lot less, a lot lower magnitude, we'll say. So that's why these things matter, because if we just tell you the definitive temperature, I'll call it, to avoid using the word absolute and offending somebody, if we use the definitive temperature pre-delta subtraction, one, the case will change in temperature, or the GPU, whatever, the product will change in temperature from test to test because fluctuations in ambient. And two, it will be different than your own ambient temperature when you add that back in. So that's why we do that. And that's really, I think that's all I have here for notes as well. So there's a lot of reasons to do this. There's a lot of variables. Things like sound testing, which is why I have this here. Sound testing, you can't do the same subtraction. We'll talk about that in the future. But if I record something at 60 decibels, which is about what I'm talking at right now, 60, 70 decibels. If we record 70 decibels for product A, and then 70 decibels for product B, we still have to subtract the noise floor, which we measure before every test, And then that subtraction is not just, for example, let's say the noise floor is 25 dB. You can't do 75 minus 25 equals 50 decibels. That's not how noise works. It's logarithmic. So we'll explain that in the future. But still the same kind of idea of presenting a delta value where we subtract out whatever the ambient environment noise or temperature is to produce a result that you can use. So there's a bit of work on your end, but it's really not that much. If you want to make it easy, add 20 Celsius to every temperature value, and you'll basically see the sort of definitive value with a 70-ish Fahrenheit house. But otherwise, it's all comparative, so you can see comparatively which product is better than the other one. If there's a big difference, then you know which one's superior. If there's a little difference, you know that because of our testing methodology, the difference is accurate and what we would call measurable, but imperceptible, which has a very specific meaning. It means that we can accurately measure and we feel confident that it is outside of any margin of error, but it is not something you would perceive as a user to be impactful to your experience. So that's what that means when I say that. But hopefully that explains delta T over ambient. If you want to learn more about our testing methodology, in the post-roll video, there will be two that are interesting to you. One, the thermal chamber video, where I put a case in a thermal chamber and validate this and show that it works. And two, the 1% lows and 0.1% low FPS video, which explains what those two things mean. So as always, Patreon link in the post-roll video if you want to help us out directly by funding future efforts. But as always, just subscribe to get more content. I'll see you all next time.